Well, welcome. Thank you for coming to our Dean's Community Lecture Series. This is the 7th in the series that we've been doing here the last few years. I'm Ron Kleinknecht. I'm Dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. I'd like to say just a couple words about the college and about this series before introducing tonight's speaker, Dr. Friday. When we became structured as a college about 4 years ago, we had as one of our goals to make closer connections with the larger Bellingham and Whatcom County communities. And we also decided that since we are an educational institution, we ought to be bringing some education out into the community. And so that's what this series is about, in order to bring some of the expertise that we have up on campus out into the community to talk to people and let you know some of the kinds of things that we're doing up there. We have one more scheduled for this year. It'll be coming this spring, and that one I think you'll also find of interest is going to be on brain disorders such as schizophrenia and Alzheimer's disease, and it will be given by Dr. Janet Finley, who is the director of our behavioral neuroscience program up at Western. She does a fantastically interesting talk. Well, now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Chris Friday. Professor Friday is professor of history at Western. He is an expert in Western history and in particular Northwest history. He's director of the Center for Northwest Studies. And as I say, he has written a number of books, a couple of books and a number of articles, given many lectures around the country. And we're very fortunate to have him here tonight to talk to us. One of his most recent accomplishments is that he began the what we call public history program, which is a minor program for students at Western in the history department. And that in particular is what he's going to talk to us about tonight, finding history in our own backyard right here in Bellingham. So please join me in welcoming Chris Friday.
Thanks, John. So this is what happens when you get to the 7th speaker, you get stuck with me, and so I'm not sure what that says about number 8 and 9 and 10. But thank you for coming out tonight. I know there's a lot of competition for you tonight. There are election results coming in. There are other events up on campus and so on. Before I start into the talk itself, I want to do one thing, and I want to tell you that tonight is my father's birthday, and he's right here in the crowd, so happy birthday, Harlow. This is when you're a really cheap son, this is what you give your father for his birthday. After how many years of subsidizing my education, this is what he gets, this lousy talk. So. When Ron strong-armed me into giving this talk, I invented a title, and then the challenge is always to find the substance to go with the title. But I thought finding history in your own backyard, your house, your neighborhood, and public history at Western Washington University and in Bellingham might be a good way for us to get started with this. One of the questions that I think we can ask before we jump into this is, what do we see when we look at a place like our own backyard, our neighborhoods, our town, and even our region? And I think that one of the values as a historian that we get when we look into these places is we begin to see them more as less as my house and increasingly as something much more complex. And I want to argue, and my students may contest this that are up in the back, up there. Notice that students never sit in the front. When you get to grow up, you move right down to the front and you want to see what's going on. History is a lot more than just a stale set of facts or even just a random set of facts that are sort of jumbled together and set someplace. History is a way of thinking about the world around us. And I know that many people who I meet today when I say, oh, I'm a history professor, I tend to get two responses. One of those is, I hated history in high school, but I love it now. And the other response is, I've always loved history. And I think people have a very warm response to history, especially as they come into seeing the world in more complicated ways too, or I'd like to hope. What do historians do? This may seem like a simple question, But I would guess that even after hours of the History Channel, you might not be quite sure what academic historians do anyway. And I think what we try to do is we ask questions about the past, oftentimes in light of the present. We are bounded by the worlds and the cultures that we live in the way that we form questions. We're not inventing the past, but we are thinking differently about it given who we are in the present day. Then we have a tendency, to at least try to, and my students again will contest this, to organize it and present it in some fashion. That could be in a public talk like this one, that could be in a book, could be in an article, could be in a classroom. That's when they'll contest whether it's organized or not. But this is essentially what historians do. Now, given that I'm talking about public history, what in the world is the difference between public history and history? And there's actually a big debate and a big divide over this thing. But I think one definition is, and it's a fairly simple one, anything outside the academic setting, anything outside the classroom. In essence, even though you may consider me an academic historian, what I'm doing right now with you is part of what public history is about, bringing it out to you. Now, you'll notice in the pictures, you'll see people like Doris Kearns Goodwin, and if you follow it very closely, you might know that she's somewhat shamed for having been charged with plagiarism, and yet she is a very public figure, an historian who is a specialist in the history of the presidency. But other people like Bruce Collette, who's a public historian in Connecticut, finds himself out on the highways and byways explaining to people what is the nature of history outside the classroom. Academic historians tend to not have very high opinions of public historians. They tend to look down upon them, to charge them with being hokey reenactors, as our folks are here in this picture, and tend to think of it as kind of a house of beans situation. That somehow look here, the marker says, history repeated itself here. And this is not real history, this is not hard thinking, hard hitting, analytical history, and they tend to poo-poo it. This would be academic historians thinking about public historians. Well, what do public historians, those group of people who are not necessarily in the classroom, tend to think about academics? A lot of charges about ivory towers and the babble of the jargon-filled world of academics. Aside from the fact that there's never any parking on campus, which is another issue. And that academics, generally speaking, are full of hot air. Why is there a divide? Look, the past does not equal history. When we do history, we're assembling our vision of the past. We never get all the documentation. We never get inside anybody's head to figure. We have enough trouble getting inside our own heads, don't we? How in the world are we going to go back into previous generations and really understand why people are making the decisions that they're making? So we are assembling from bits and pieces to reconstruct and present our ideas about the past. And that's really what history is. And those creations are themselves historic documents. My talk today is a historic document from today. So even me doing this is in essence producing a kind of historical record about what this strange man from Western seems to think about history and our locale. So when I give a lecture in class and my students fall asleep on their desk, history repeats itself, which is a way to explain why it's so boring. All right, my students fall asleep. The 4 or 5 students back up there, they're the ones that usually don't fall asleep. When we publish in a scholarly book or article, we're creating a document. When we publish a popular book or article, we're creating a document. When we create museum displays, we're creating a document. When we create a walking tour, some of you may have even been on this walking tour down at Fisherman's Wharf. There's other walking tours of the York District and so on here in town. Each of these things in and of itself is a historic document. So why is there a divide then between public history and history? It has to do with assumptions that people have about authority and legitimacy, and because I have a piled higher and deeper after my name, that I have some authority to tell you what you should think about something. And I think this is a kind of silly debate. Sorry. No explanation may be needed for this particular thing. Public history has actually been done for a long time at Western. The Center for Pacific Northwest Studies that I'm associated with has been in existence since 1971. It's been collecting local documents for researchers and for the public. It's been publishing studies and sponsoring talks and all kinds of things. Huxley College, in its activities, it's been around since the 1970s. The creation of forest reserves and interpretive materials that go around that all are part of what could be subsumed under public history. PEHR, our Dean Knudsen is from that department. We have many people working in the park systems in a variety of capacities, many of them doing activities that potentially are related to public history. PE, Health and Recreation Department. Anthropology, long history in working in the public, doing archaeology, doing cultural resource management. The history department is sort of a latecomer, unfortunately, which I'll admit to in front of the dean here. And we started this new minor then only in the last year. And really, it came out of realization for me personally that since I have been a little kid, I've been doing some kind of public history. Whether that was dressing up as a mountain man. Students, you're not to repeat this. Whether it was writing a nomination for a National Historic Place or following a Reagan Road in college, or working more recently with a tribe on behalf of a tribe for a court case, or talking to you now, along with all of the, quote, academic stuff. I've been doing this public stuff as well. And it was one of those realizations that our students need to understand that the thing that they love, the thing that they really enjoy doing, studying history, doesn't have to be limited to the classroom. And there should be many places to look for that and apply that. So I started a new minor, mostly because starting a new major is way too difficult. And one of the things that I want us to do then is, as we focus locally in this program in public history, is to think about a term that specialists call landscape. And I'm going to help you define that term, or define that term with you, or for you tonight, and so you can see how it could apply. We're going to come back to this map and take a look at it as we go. Landscape is a fairly new term, really been used since the 1990s. And the idea behind it is that nature is not something that exists apart from people. Nature is something that is usually affected by human interaction. And so that wilderness is an invention. The idea of a pristine place separate from people's impact is kind of silly when we think about it. In this instance then, what we think of being natural or wild is really part and related to human interactions with places. Now what this allows us to do when we think about places is then to include not just buildings, but all of the parts of the surroundings and the people and animals in it as being part of a larger system. Now, in all practical purposes, what this means is agricultural fields are part of landscape. Wagon ruts, gardens, most forests. I love to talk with my students about the Arboretum, Seaholm Hill. And I show them a picture of Old Main in 1911, and behind Old Main is a clear cut. And it looks pretty much like a war zone. Trees, stumps, everything back there. Then I asked them to think about how they see that landscape today. And for them, oh, it's natural, it's wild, it's about as wild as the Palouse wheat crops are in terms of it's a highly cultivated, highly managed place. Now, it doesn't make it any less beautiful, but it is a landscape that has been heavily manipulated by the presence of people. A student of mine a while back did a very interesting study comparing the coal mines that we'll talk about a little bit tonight. And you guys saw that Harold trumped me on this, but over the weekend, the little piece about the coal mines that came out. But my students the student did a comparison of the coal mines and Cornwall Park. And his argument was they're the same thing. The park is structured so that people interact with the landscape in the same way that the mine is structured so that people can interact with that landscape. They both direct you in and out in certain ways to take certain things away from the experience in the park. So if that seems kind of esoteric and weird, well, maybe it'll make more sense later in the night. So a couple of you were looking a little bit skeptical, but now, there are much earlier terms in public history. Much of public history started quite early, really in the late 19th century, as people look back, in the United States anyway, to old historic sites, early houses, early architecture of very, very early settlers, to kind of create a sense of antiquity in the United States that we don't really have in comparison to many spots in Europe. We're as good as Europe, then where are our old buildings? Oh, it's here. It's in this location. They tended to focus on elite sites of high culture that they thought were worthy of salvage. And by the way, this glorious structure that's ours in this picture would not have been included. Because earlier on they were looking at really 17th and 18th century structures, not necessarily late 19th century structures. By the 1930s, a place like our courthouse here in the picture would have been considered one of those early sites of architecture that we would have placed here on a pedestal as this is a place worthy of knowing and studying. Beginning in the 1930s, specialists started talking more about built environment rather than historic architecture, which allowed them eventually to include things like the WPA Bridge in Whatcom Falls Park that many of you know about. This building, City Hall, built in 1938 as a part of a WPA project. But even ultimately things that we treasure so much in Bellingham, those craftsman-style bungalow houses that people like Catherine live in. Actually, those were considered early on in this time frame too mundane and common. Those were the ranch houses of the 1930s, 20s and 30s were the bungalows. Those were the big tract developments that were being produced at the time. Now we see them as essential to the character of our town, right? Most of our historic districts are populated by these houses, especially as we broaden that definition out. So the term landscape got used then in the 1990s to begin to think about other types of places. Places like Georgia Pacific. There's a landscape with lots of human interaction. There's a place that's certainly a part of the history of Bellingham, and yet we might look past it as a kind of rusting, decrepit, declining waterfront unless we were trying to incorporate consciously places like this rather than the beautiful courthouse. It also includes places like the Woodstock Farm here on the way to Larrabee State Park. And one of the great things about this particular park here, and I'll try to put my cursor so that you can see it, that really gets us at landscape. We've got the farm area, we've got the wonderful buildings. What really intrigues me is the tide flat and the railroad tracks. Tidal action, because of the building of the tracks, tidal action behind here has silted all this up. And that is no more natural than the railroad, but yet it's very much a part of the landscape. So we would even think about how things are transformed by human impact, even even in recent years. There are two key programs that we've been involved in the early stages of this public history program here and the Center for Pacific Northwest Studies are an oral history project in and around Georgia Pacific. The second one that I'll talk in a little bit more detail about then tonight are the historic neighborhood surveys taking place right now. Nobody's here from the city tonight, but Katie Frank's working with the city of Bellingham, and the Magnolia Courts is a great spot there in the York district. The Walking Museum and the Bellingham Public Library, along with volunteers from a number of different neighborhoods, are very important in trying to put this together. Now, in that early Georgia Pacific waterfront history, and we sort of stumbled into that. Over a couple quarters, I got about 20 students committed, which is sometimes hard to do, to go off campus and interview a number of people who had worked at Georgia Pacific before it was really fully shut down and these people had moved on to other places and other stages in their lives. We ended up doing 18 oral histories. Some of those names may be familiar to some of you. I know my father knows Ken Blackmore from out at the airport and other places. But a long list of people, certainly not comprehensive, but many who worked in a lot of different places and facilities within Georgia Pacific. Now this is at that site now where the university and the city are talking about what do we do here, how can we develop this, what can we do with it. And I saw part of our role as capturing what this site meant to several generations of people in Bellingham. Most of our students, when they first started learning about this, because one of the things I required them to do was understand what is a pulp mill, what does it do, what are the actual processes there, what are the different jobs that people have. Most of our students started with the impression that this place was evil. It is a polluter, it's a nasty thing. Not necessarily untrue, and yet what they came to understand as they talked to the people who had worked there, as they listened to the people whose lives had been involved and deeply embedded in this community and in working at that site, is that it was very much a part of the life and livelihood of this place during that time. In fact, our students at Western are migrant birds. They come seasonally and they leave. In spite of the fact that you think that every job in town is occupied by a former Western graduate, most of them are very transitory. They have no sense of the place. They have no sense even of the university. The university exists in their minds in a 4 or 5 or 6 year time span, depending on the students, and then they're gone. They don't see a depth of meaning at the place that allows them to understand that the Georgia Pacific closure is the tail end of the industrial era here that really has been a century or more in the making. They don't see a waterfront occupied by 14 mills and all number of salmon canneries that were the lifeblood of this place. Dean Kleinknecht came to Western what year? 1970. 3 years after the closure of the Pacific American Fisheries Plant, once the largest cannery in the world. You're a newcomer. You've lived in a deindustrializing Bellingham. It's taken most of your career. But that's the world that he's seen and lived with. Our students don't see that. They don't see a depth of place, a depth of meaning in the landscape. They got there. They started to get there, this small group of students. And one of them produced this film, Smells Like Money, And I'll give a pitch for it. You can buy it, I think, at Henderson's for 20 bucks. There's the price tag. That's how much I paid for my copy. But, and what these students did, and he among them, I'll read the text here for you. The pulp mill on Bellingham's waterfront was more than just a pulp mill to its employees, for whom the plant represented stability, innovation, and many close friendships. This film deals with the story of the pulp mill using a combination of interviews, images, historic film clips, newspaper articles, television reports to show the human side of a place and people that many have labeled their enemy. This is a huge transformation for a student who told me at the beginning that he really did think he was going to uncover the dirt about this nasty, horrible place that had fouled Bellingham's waterfront. This is a depth of maturity and understanding, and I'm really, really proud of his ability to make that transition. Now, the people he interviewed weren't about to say that they had fouled this place, and because they did not understand their participation in that way and refused to tell him otherwise. So there's a good lesson for the creation of history, the nature of your documents, but also the transition into something else other than what the original assumption was going to be. This material lives on then as part of our obligation to history in the archives at the Center for Pacific Northwest Studies. All of the materials that I collected for the students, the papers that they wrote, the journals that the students wrote, the interviews that they did, the raw footage that the one student shot to make the film, is all there for the archival record, so that somebody else interested in this thing can also go back, look at those same documents rather than relying on just what the student gleaned from them. And so those have a continued life. So when I look down out over the bay from Western, and I see GP, I see part of what was in a long-standing industrial waterfront and the closure of one episode. I see a student transformed and a place transforming simultaneously. That there's a complexity to that place that I keep adding to, and in the addition, I'm hoping things are not being taken away. Memory may prove me wrong on that. The next speaker's on what? Oh, Alzheimer's. Yeah, that's right. Okay. I have a terrible sense of humor. I mean, it's not good, but the other major thing that we're engaged in right now as a big part of the public history program, and when I say we, I mean they, Forrest and Natalie are in the back up there. And how many hours did you spend going through microfilm this week? Countless, by the look on your face. They're engaged in doing some research that I'll tell you about in a second. There are historic neighborhoods, as many of you know, already in Bellingham. It's part of a process by which local tax breaks and considerations can be given, and it's a way to preserve the character of the communities, especially within the town. Seaholm Hill has been a recent addition. The neighborhoods got together with the city to develop a sort of broader plan. In the more recent iteration of this, there's a neighborhood survey in anticipation of nominating whole districts here as historic districts. And those include the lettered streets, South Hill, which I couldn't find their sign. It must be there someplace. And the York District are the three districts that the city is working with right now and with those neighborhood associations. And I'll hazard a guess that some of you here are in those neighborhoods or in those neighborhood associations. There have been multiple meetings, so fresh meat then for the cause here. What happened is several years ago, well, I'll just give you a sense of the existing historic districts and sites downtown. A number of buildings have been nominated from downtown as historic buildings, but the integrity of the whole area downtown has been shifted enough over time that it's difficult to nominate the whole area as a historic district. And by the way, historic in this sense means, is it 50 years old? And I'm not there yet. But this works with the city's historic preservation ordinance that allows local historic districts, and the idea that the city hopes that this will maintain a very strong character of the neighborhood. So the Cornwall Park neighborhoods are here along Broadway. There's a sense of wanting to maintain the front yards without what are technically called snout houses, the one where you drive right up over your front lawn to get to your garage, and having access only come through the alley and so on. The wonderful bungalows that don't have those garages stuck on the side. If we work with the city on zoning, for example, if that's been a long-term characteristic of the neighborhood, we can work to retain that characteristic with new buildings that come in too. So it's the idea is to use this. So one of the issues here is we take existing buildings, the old Baptist School of Industry, which later became Acres Taxidermy, and Acres Taxidermy has been in just about every historic building in town, as you'll see in a minute. But here's what it looked like. And some of these properties can be updated. That's now kind of studio space and some condos being renovated on the inside and make it a dramatic transformation, still maintaining a nice sense of the building and the neighborhood. Now, our students haven't done anything with this yet, but this gives you an idea of some of the things that can happen. So in this historic neighborhood surveys, we've got a series of partners, the city, the museum, the library, neighborhood association themselves, individual property owners. We've had a number of meetings about how to do and research your own property history, and if you're interested in that, the State Archives building here will be having another of those, and if it's not there, I think it'll be at the public library, where you can learn how do you research the history of your exact piece of property if you wish, and are there extant photos of it in previous times, and these types of things. So we're looking at these districts here. There's been an initial survey, kind of light level, of what properties looked like they were built at what time, beginning in the 1890s all the way up into about 1960, which gets us just to the very edge of the, quote, historic time, and you get a sense of the lettered streets and South Hill and York. This survey's already been done. What we're working with at Western is to involve students through historical research and internships, mostly working as slave laborers for me right now, but perhaps other things as we move along here. So this winter we had 6 history students and 4 anthropology students working with the city. Now that may not seem like a lot, but the students are doing great works, and perhaps if you want to ask them what they're doing and was there really any value in this, you can ask them after the talk tonight. We're looking like we're going to have between 8 and 10 students in history alone, continuing to work on this in the spring. We may continue some through the summer and fall and working with the neighborhoods on this project. So one of the things that the students did is I put them on these old fire insurance maps. The Sanborn Fire Insurance Company developed these wonderful large-scale books with beautiful colors pasted in and so on. And I had my students set to the exciting task of going for each of these through each of these neighborhoods for the books that are in existence from 1907 to 1963, keeping track of where each non-residential structure was and what was happening there. One of the things that will be very valuable for the neighborhoods is if they can go to the city and say, this structure actually used to be a commercial structure, not residential. And it may allow the city and the neighborhood then to keep an economic base in the neighborhood in ways that might not be possible if it's been converted to a dwelling space and it wasn't obviously one before. So beyond just thinking about my individual piece of property, then we're thinking about the whole neighborhood and shifts and changes. And I have to yet comb through what the students handed me and their journals where they're recording this. But I know that in looking at some of those structures, they learned what was a livery stable in 1907, became an auto repair place in the 1930s, may not have been in existence in the 1950s. But seeing those kinds of shifts and changes across time in the neighborhood that they're looking at, I'm hoping allows them to see those layers of shifts and changes that take place, just like what happened on the waterfront. So as they drive through a neighborhood now, do you see it differently? Mostly in terror, oh, Friday's going to give us some other weird assignment and let's get out of here. So then I asked them to go to those spots and take a picture of what's there now. So then they're producing a historical document. The record that they've pulled together, plus the photo of that place now. Is it the same? Is it commercial at all? Is there anything there? Is there a condo building there? What is there? Is the freeway there? Which was another problem. The thing that's killing the students right now is that they're going through the manuscript census records. Now, some of you interested in genealogy have looked for individuals, I'll assume, through these things. There's a great interest in genealogy right now. What my students are doing is compiling a database of all the people in that neighborhood, starting with the most recent available census in 1930 and going backward. Like, one of the things that I assumed is we probably know less about Bellingham in 1930 than we know about Bellingham in 1900. See, when I ask my students, think of something historical. Black and white photos, old maps, ancient things. But historical is also a relative term. And so I thought, we know this will get us there, and it's also the biggest and most difficult one too. But we're going to take these students through the multiple generations of students who come through this program and march them backward. What they're doing in creating this database is then we'll certainly make it available to any and all who want to use it in a public forum. But they're also allowing the people doing the consultant project for the historic nomination to say, the lettered streets demographically look like this in one time frame, and this in another, and this in another time frame. So that we can say, was it really a working neighborhood? Was it a neighborhood for workers in the waterfront? Or were there something else? Boarders, lodgers, you guys have seen a lot of boarders. It also raises the question, well, who's running the boarding house? Is it mostly women? Are they widowed? That certainly was a pattern up near the university. A lot of those tenement houses that are still tenement houses for students have been, at least since the 1920s, student flop houses run by, at that point in time, usually a widow who invested her pension money and bought into the place. So I think this gives a depth of understanding of the community that isn't there, and that one of the resources that even 6 students bring, logging 80 hours of work in the quarter, is substantially more than any one of you would log on your own to create this database and then to create this resource for the whole community. Now, that's horribly tedious work, and they complain to me regularly about it. A little more exciting thing that they've done for this project is to go through photograph collections. And the problem with many of the photograph collections in our town that are in public archives, like the museum or the Center for Pacific Northwest Studies, is they're not labeled 1905 J Street. They're labeled, Bill Wilson in front of his house, 1910. Who's Bill and why should we care? And so what I had the students try to do is to go through these collections in the Center for Pacific Northwest Studies collection. And based on the descriptions that are there, plus their own eyeballing, to try to see if they can identify which photos at least go with which neighborhood, if at all possible. Now, if any of you have done any photographic research in town and you've gone to the museum, you just talk to Jeff Jewell, and he has a memory of every single photo that's ever been taken anywhere, and tell you who's standing third row from the left, too. If Jeff gets run over by a bus, however, we're going to lose all of that. Jeff, sorry. He's not here. I'm just waving at the camera right now. And so the idea is, and Jeff has done a good job, too, of trying to identify photos, not just on their description on the back, but also then how can other people get access to them. So this is one of the things that the students did. So I'm hoping that my students, in looking at these photos, find the territorial courthouse in that shape, find the territorial courthouse in that shape, and there it is again, as a taxidermy building, and find the historical courthouse in that shape, and also in its current shape. If they can look at that building and see these layers of use across time, it seems to me that they will be coming away with a much more mature vision of place, a much more mature vision of what history is in and of itself. So beyond then being just helping hands, helping you folks out in your collective community efforts to find out more about your neighborhood, I'm asking the students to think about landscapes, not just a singular landscape, but landscapes. Now that simplistically we can say, oh, I look at Fairhaven Park and I think about Fairhaven Park at its formulation. Somewhat different, although not radically different. Whatcom Falls Park Bridge in its current formulation, or in a previous, earlier formulation, when it was first built. I want them, though, to get beyond that just simple then and now, and to think about what happens to places as they themselves transform. Whether it's a structure like the old courthouse that after a fire had to be rebuilt. And think about buildings and landscapes in the context of disasters and accidents, plan changes. In fact, to see much of what's around them as really impermanent rather than permanent. That the change is what is guaranteed rather than the permanence. The waterfront itself has gone through many, many changes. There's no sense in stopping that, but seeing those changes and recognizing them as part of the era in which they happened. I want them to see layers of time and use. This is a view many of you have seen before, right? Looking down there from Maritime Heritage Park up at that. But if we step in time and perspective a little bit, what we see in that same general location is an Indian seasonal fishing village with the bustling city right up above it. It's a landscape that we tend not to think of in Bellingham because the Indians are over there across the bay. But I can guarantee that people on the reservation certainly have stories about where different fishing camps are and have been. And even as they walk through this park, are probably seeing multiple landscapes at the same time. So all of those tents there are part of the seasonal fishing camp along the base of Whatcom Creek. I want my students, when they go to Albertsons, out there on Northwest, to see this as well, the Bellingham coal mines. And this is where the Herald scooped me a little bit on this. In fact, I want my students to maybe think about something, a terrible academic making up terms, the possibility of ghostscapes. Back in the 1970s, Maxing Hong Kingston was a fairly well-known author, and she still is today. She wrote a book called Chinamen. Some of you heard of that? Yes, no, maybe so. Students hate this part when you ask rhetorical questions. Maxing Hong Kingston is a Chinese-American writer. And she said that America is a land without ghosts. And what she meant by that is that the deep history of Chinese people in the place wasn't there, and that it seemed to be a very transitory place without deep connections. Now that may well have been for her, and it certainly is for most of us as Westerners. I didn't understand colonial American history. Students, you should tune this part out. I didn't understand colonial American history until after I was done with graduate school and had my first teaching job in the Boston area. And I went into Boston, and I went to the graveyard there in downtown Boston. I think it's near the Granary. Yeah? And 1647, whatever the gravesite was. And that was the first time I felt a sense of that we really do have a deep national history in that place and here. As a Westerner, if something's in 1890, oh, that's really old, that's so ancient here. I hope I've gotten a little bit more sophisticated sense of history over the several decades now since I first started teaching. But this idea of ghostscapes, in other words, a landscape full of memory that continues to exist, struck me as a kind of powerful way to think about this. And I want to sort of suggest to you that we might think about this. In fact, the coal mines are a really, really great way to think about this. The shaded spot here that you can see is the underground location of most of the mine shafts of this area. And some of you are familiar with this. Many of you are familiar with this. One of my favorite maps is a map that we have at the Center for Pacific Northwest Studies. And it's about 3.5 feet wide by about 12 feet long. And it shows every mine shaft from the entrance of the mine all the way out to the bay. And if you can make out above this, so the north, south, east, west lines here are actually the mine shaft and the pillars. And up above it, you can see running Maplewood at an angle, and northwest, looks like it's running north-south there. The map actually shows the surface streets and structures above the mine shaft when the map was created in the 1920s. And it seems to me that what this map allows us to do is to see multiple landscapes in time. We have a surface and a subsurface structure here, multiple uses of the place. And if we think about that now, we think about it across time as well. I can't go past Albertsons, which is not too far from my home, and think about the people's working lives, the people in my neighborhood who at one point worked there. I can't think about the covenant in my deed to my house that says the coal mine company gets the coal down below. I hope that that doesn't happen, but. So we're left with this question then, what does public history accomplish? I think it accomplishes for Western students, painfully sometimes for them, it gets them off campus in a positive way. It gets them to understand Bellingham as something more than temporary housing. It gets them to see historic or ghost landscapes over more than a 4-year history. Because their history is only as long as they've been here, really, in this place, unless we can stretch that. And I think it also gets them to understand the application of their major, which is history, to something other than the academic setting. The possibilities that this is something that doesn't have to be done in a classroom, that has meaning out beyond the classroom. For Western, I think it lets us be something more than the ivory tower on the hill without parking. Now, but more seriously, it offers a resource that we have. Student hours, limited faculty expertise to the broader community. And it engages students in the life of their temporary home, which is, I think, a really important thing. I'm hoping that this handful of students who cycle through this look at Bellingham differently and think about Bellingham differently and interact with Bellingham differently, so that you will understand them differently too. What does the community get out of this? What do you folks get out of this? This should add to what you value about the place. It should add to how you can understand the place by the contributions that the students are making to creating these databases, to identifying photos, to create a sense of place that has a deep and layered set of meanings. So if we think about landscapes and ghostscapes, does knowing different histories in our own backyards allow us to see the same things? Is this just, it's not my backyard. My backyard would be littered with soccer stuff and other types of things. But I look back there in my own backyard and I think about the ways that Squalicum Creek must have come through there over the millennia. I think about the coal mine down below. I think about the creation of Cornwall Park as an auto camp at one point in time. I think about the falls there being a fisheries site. There are lots and lots of things going on simultaneously as I look in my backyard and in my neighborhood. Rather than just thinking, who lived in my house and what's the legal history of this structure, to try to see the structure existing in a broader landscape. And that was really what I'm hoping the point of my talk here tonight is that I think that public history is a way for all of us to think about landscape, not just my little academic corner, not just my house that I live in, but my storied world, my storied landscape that I have to understand in order to be something more than just a user and abuser of history.